Hello, friends. I talk a lot about the punk rock, right? All those punk rockers, man. That was a big thing when I was in high school and around that time. It was a big, groundbreaking thing. It sort of changed the landscape of music because suddenly anyone could start a band. And that was liberating for a lot of people who loved music and wanted to play music. Suddenly, it was okay to not appear to be wealthy, gigantic megastar. Suddenly, it was okay to have pawn shop instruments, guitars that you bought for 50 bucks at the pawn shop downtown, and a guitar amp with a big hole in the front of it that you maybe tried to stitch back up with safety pins or something. That kind of aesthetic became okay. Wearing your regular street clothes instead of you know a denim cape with a top hat or something. The It was okay to just wear like a shredded T-shirt and leather jacket and your those skinny jeans everybody was wearing. It was okay to just look like one of the people who comes to see your band. You were part of your audience. That was a big aspect of it. You weren't above them. You were them. Anyway, that was my take on it. It didn't last very long. Sadly, it became very uniform and very cliquish and very exclusive. And you aren't punk enough, and these are punk. Those aren't. It turned into one of those things, of course. But in the early days, we hear about the origins of punk rock, and around that same time, um, it wasn't quite punk rock. There was other stuff going on that was kind of included in that big cloud of new music that was happening. That was all a response to the dinosaur rock, the rock that we call dinosaur rock, which was like all the bands that we heard on the radio endlessly, the super mega stars, the giant stage productions of their live shows, the rock and roll lifestyle that we used to see in documentaries about the bands, where they lived in massive gothic mansions and had a huge collection of vintage cars and motorcycles. And that sort of lifestyle, I think people started reacting to in these days, because the economy was not so great. And we were dealing with all these things, the aspects of politics in America and in England that were making everybody frustrated and angry, and you felt like there was no future. And I think a lot of people were reacting to that in a way by the self-expression through music, which I've also talked about quite a bit, and how I don't really think that happens nowadays as much. Music is not the touchstone that it once was. It used to be our touchstone. It was our hub. Music was where it all came from. We got together with our friends because of music. We met our friends because of music. We played music. Everybody had records. You would go to somebody's house and look through their records and determine whether or not you wanted to be friends with them. Honestly, you would meet people because you liked the same music and had the same ideas about the popular culture that was happening around the music. Um, in New York in the late 70s, there were some clubs that appeared in the sort of sketchy neighborhoods that brought in a sort of a miraculous confluence of incredible bands. You hear about that club CBGBs, and you get a list of the bands that played there in the early days, and it's like, oh, all the best bands played there. Ramones, everybody, Talking Heads. But how different were the Talking Heads to the Ramones? So different, so vastly different. And yet they both had that kind of do it yourself aesthetic. They both had a kind of thing that told their audiences, you can do this too. Um, but in that way, they were united. Bands like Blondie and all the other bands that played in those clubs, they were basically making a lot of the people in the audience realize, I could do that myself. I can afford a guitar like he's playing. I can get an amplifier and I can write songs. It wasn't out of reach anymore. That was the great thing about those days. Um, Unfortunately, it didn't last long enough. It kind of came and went and turned into marketing and, people that were selling it and people that were sort of creating it to be that. And it kind of lost its beauty. It lost the art and the craft, and became this kind of uniform thing. And then suddenly a lot of the bands started putting labels on themselves, like we are this, which is a hybrid of this, which is on level 2 of this genre. We are this subset of genre A, that kind of thing where labeling became so important. And if you weren't a member of this specific genre subset, you were not cool. You were not allowed in this club, etc. Anyway, one of the bands that did not care about the labels, I mean, bands like Talking Heads and Ramones, they didn't really care about the labels so much. They were just doing what they wanted to do. And they would play together. Ramones and Talking Heads and Blondie and all these bands would play together. One band I have conspicuously not mentioned yet was perhaps my favorite of those early CBGB bands that did not care about the labels. They weren't trying to be any one thing. You can't really categorize them. They're kind of punk rock. They're kind of new wave. They're not, though. They were kind of like Talking Heads, but not like Talking Heads. I'm talking about Television. And yes, I know this is a CD, but I have them on vinyl somewhere. But I think I've listened to this CD more recently, so it's closer. This album right here, Television, Marquee Moon, is one of the best albums from this era. It's just one of my favorite albums of all time. It never stops appealing to me. It never stops sounding fresh to me. There's a sound here that doesn't sound dated. You don't get the impression that they're trying to be punk rock or that they're trying to be glam or rock or prog or any genre. They're simply playing music that they were inspired to play. The two guitar players, I think most notably, take this music into a sort of a complex world. I don't want to say progressive rock. I don't want to say prog. But they had elements of complexity to the music that I've always loved. There was a guitar interplay between the two guitar players, Tom Verlaine and Richard Lloyd. Where is he on here? Yeah, Richard Lloyd and Tom Verlaine, two guitar players who were both kind of rhythm players, both lead players. Richard Lloyd may be more of a lead player because Tom Verlaine was the singer. And while he was singing, there was, Richard Lloyd could add these sort of atmospherics, these guitar arpeggios and things. They played in a way that a lot of people use the term interplay, interwoven, juxtaposing each other. One person would be playing one part, another person would be playing another part, and they blend together so well. The notes, the melodies, the structure, and just the style of the music is so unusual for the time. The songs are incredible too. The songwriting, even without that brilliant guitar interplay, the songs stand on their own too. The lyrics are great. The lyrics are great street level poetry that I think at the time there were people that were, like the Patti Smith types that were writing these sort of New York street poetry of the day. In those days when the New York streets were quite different than they are now, if you go to New York City now and go to these areas, CBGB, the club itself, is some kind of a clothing store now, like some sort of fashion clothing store, which is kind of sad, but time goes on. But the at the time in New York, things were kind of gritty, like dirty and a little sketchy and scary. I know when I went there in the 80s, going to these clubs to see these bands. And it was a bit scary for me because I was a kid from small town, and a small town in a slightly larger town when I moved. But New York was a massive, mysterious, scary, sketchy city to me. And going into these places where these clubs were was serious, man. You were going somewhere. You were going into the depths of something in the heart of the city. But going to those places, you saw where these bands were writing from. It was in the days before it was prohibitively expensive to live in Manhattan in those neighborhoods. You could still find a loft, and people were buying, or not buying, probably renting these sort of lofts. People were squatting in these abandoned factory places. And it wasn't at that point, Andy Warhol, had the loft and kind of popularized the idea of living in repurposed industrial space. And, a lot of us in those days lived in that kind of a situation where, that way you could have your band could practice in the living room and there was nobody around to hear it. And you could afford it. You could make a big mess. You could get power tools into your living room, and you could sometimes bring your motorcycle into the living room. But it was a style of living that a lot of these bands were writing about. A lot of bands were also writing about the struggles of living in that time, in those times. That also fueled the kind of punk rock sensibilities where there was an anger underlying things, or an idea of this sort of rebellious nature of not really liking the way the world was at the time. And Television did a little bit of that in their music. There was a lot of the songs on here just had a feel of the city, though. Like it's a very New York album. To me, I think it's one of the most New York albums, but it is a specific time and place of New York. But the musicianship on here, of course, the drummer, bass player, incredible. But Tom Verlaine and Richard Lloyd's guitars are legend, and I never get tired of Marquee Moon. That album just continues to make me happy and to take me back. You listen to the words, you listen to the way Tom Verlaine sort of barks and yelps these words sometimes, and the way he's not trying to sing with any kind of aggression. He's singing in his voice, and the music is coming from their experience and from their lives and from the streets and from a real place. They're not like a top Billboard charts kind of a band, and I don't think they ever intended to be. I think they were setting poetry to music, and musical poetry with words. And I love them. I love Television. Tom Verlaine also did some solo albums. He did some work. They all did solo albums, I think. Richard Lloyd did a solo album that's quite good. This one's called Dreamtime by Tom Verlaine. It is quite good. It's quite worth listening to. But Marquee Moon is one of those magical moment albums. There were other Television albums as well, but I love Marquee Moon. If you want to be the Television completist, all of their albums are great. But I recommend going into the Television experience by getting into Marquee Moon. It's one of those albums that'll be with you for the rest of your life. If you're like me, you'll listen to it every so often just to get recharged with that feeling, that sense of place and time that it brings me, and also just the beautiful guitar work, the great lyrics, the wonderful songwriting, everything about it. Great album. And thank you for listening to me, and I'll talk to you again real soon.